Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have Jordan Lips and Bryan Boorstein back on the podcast, our roundtable that we do every couple months. Excited to have you boys back on the podcast today.
What's up, man?
Jordan is outside enjoying the Carolina weather today and staying away from his baby, making sure he doesn't wake her up. But yeah, excited to have you guys on. Got some cool topics to chat about, all related to hypertrophy. But first, always just want to touch base on either what's been going on, how training's going. Bryan, I'll start with you, man, if you want to start off with that, if there's anything going on, and then anything from like a training standpoint that you want to talk about or anything like that.
Yeah, just chugging along with my 2 times a week full body, super low volume, low frequency program. This is like my new thing I'm experimenting with. It's probably going to end up being a minimum of 9 months total to basically take me through the fall and the winter until bike season starts up again. I'm just going to keep training twice a week. And then my guess is that if that goes as well as I expect it to go, I may just keep with that for the long term, for eternity. It's been great. Like I've been doing it now for 2 months. And before that, it was 5 sessions every 2 weeks. So it wasn't quite twice a week, but it was, man, I've been training basically since March with no more than 2.5 sessions a week average. And it's just been great. Like strength is going up. I don't feel like I'm losing anything aesthetically at this point. I'm very curious to see long term if that's still the case. If I go another 6 to 9 months of this, what does my physique look like at that point? Personally, I don't really expect to see a change, but I think it'll be interesting to follow along. And the impetus for starting to do that was just to be able to ramp up more cardio volume and not have as much crossover fatigue from one to the other. And I think it's worked because bike season is wrapping up right now in basically the last few days of guaranteed good weather here. And then it is unpredictable. And so I did 2 of these really big climbs that I use as my benchmarks for my fitness. One of them is a 20 to 25 minute climb on the bike, and another one is a approximately 10-minute climb. And so this year am 196 pounds. Last year at this time, I was 180 pounds. And despite being 16 pounds heavier, I just PR'd both of those climbs this week. So I did the long one, I PR'd by about 1:45. And the short one, I PR'd by about 45 seconds, getting some really amazing and unexpected improvement, especially considering my body weight. And just call it like a super successful season of current training, doing this whole hybrid thing and trying to be one of the cool kids.
Do you think again, I know we've talked about this, but like the nutrition side, just like, are you just again making sure that you're eating enough and you think that is helping the performance, or is it because you feel like you've maintained muscle maybe better than in the past as well too? Or
dude, I don't know, man. It's everything I read tells me that I should do worse at climbing hills on my bike as a heavier human. And yeah, maybe there's something as far as I'm more recovered, I'm more resilient, I have more power. Like that's for sure true. Like I definitely have more power as a heavier human, but that's supposed to work against you on a hill. So, I mean, I would just honestly probably attest it to just better training in general. Last year at this time, it was August before I finally was like giving in and saying, I cannot train 5 times a week in the gym and also bike 5 or 6 times a week. I just can't do that anymore. That was late August last year. So I think I'd already gotten myself into a bit of a hole. And this year, just immediately cutting lifting back to twice a week and actually really only biking 5 days a week. I don't think I had too many 6-day weeks this year. So I'm prioritizing recovery a bit more, putting my body through a bit less of that crazy double hybrid pursuit thing. I think it just took me a year to learn that lesson that I needed to do less. And I think that is what I'm giving credit to as far as why I think there's been such further success this year on the bike.
for your exercise selection for hypertrophy, anything that you've either really been enjoying, and then like some things that you considered with having a like lower frequency approach like this?
Good question. So it's like super low volume, super low frequency. So each of my 2 workouts throughout the week has one leg movement. So I'm talking either hamstrings or quads. So I'm really only hitting quads once a week and hamstrings once a week. And then it has a movement for the pressing structure, a movement for the pulling structure, and then either a lateral raise or a curl or a tricep extension. And so it just varies across each workout. So there's only 4 exercises, and I'm just trying to pick exercises that I can use heavy loads in the 5 to 8 rep range and get a great stimulus with those loads, safely take them to failure. And it's been a lot of the standard selection that you would expect. Like my chest movements are incline cable fly press, which I have you doing right now, which is chef's kiss. It's amazing. I have a decline press that's not a fly, that's just more of a pressy movement, like that dip or decline press. And then I have a steep incline press. So not the fly press for the chest, but more of an interior delt style pressing movement. And those are really my three presses. My three pulls are a neutral grip cable lat pull down, T-bar row, also neutral grip, and then a pronated pull up. Oh, and I have an upper back cable row. So I do have four different back movements in there, two lat specific and two upper back focused. And then legs, I have a hack squat and a pendulum. So I'm not doing any leg extensions at the moment. And then I have a leg curl and an RDL. And for arms, I have one curl. So I'm doing a face away curl for my curl. I do a long head tricep extension for my one tricep movement. And then I have two lateral delt movements. I do a standing behind the back cable raise, and then the lying one that with the princess headrest that Jordan loves, the lying cross cable Y raise. I do that one as well. So one that goes from front to back and one that goes from back to front. And that's my entire thing. It's 16 total exercises.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's cool. I just wanted to hear how you like prioritize that. So again, it's exercises that you can safely take close to failure. And then you are just trying to make sure you're hitting those main movement patterns and trying to divvy it up between the upper back and the pressing and everything like that too. Yeah, those Y raises, those are good. I know Jordan, I've seen you do those too. And Bryan, you hit on that as well. Those are good. I like those a lot. Cool. Jordan, what about you, man? How's everything going with you? How's training on your end?
Yeah, it's going good. Yeah, Bryan, just quickly on your bike scenario, I do find that super interesting. You're like, I'm 16 pounds heavier on a climb that would be not productive. There's a lot going on. Like you could be, right, like less fatigue, a year of improved fitness, but still like huge win to be heavier and fitter on a climb. So that's hats off to you, man. That's fucking awesome. That's a testament to a year of really good training. So good stuff on you. And both not surprising, but also just your intelligent decision to do a little less lifting and see greater performance at this other thing. So yeah, that's awesome. I definitely feel that too.
Appreciate you, bro. That's awesome.
Oh,
Thank
it's
you.
awesome. I'm at 3 days a week lifting, 3 days a week cardio. Alex and I are running through the gamut of every distance, trying to train for 12 weeks, do a distance, train for 12 weeks, do a distance. Everything from a marathon down. We didn't really set out exactly what I wanted to do, but I was like, hey, I want to be as educated to help people gain cardiovascular fitness as I am in hypertrophy and strength. And so to do that, I got to live it for a couple of years, I think, before I even say things about it. And I want to understand a bit of the nuance. Hypertrophy is cool because it's super forgiving, such a wide range of rep ranges, and you can do so many things like slightly suboptimally. It's still awesome. But I think there's a little bit, I at least went into the cardio stuff thinking there was a little bit more nuance, whatever. So I'm like, hey, I want to compete at everything from whatever, a marathon down to the 40 meter. I thought, let me hit every single thing. I want to train for 12 weeks, learn what I can about the nuances of training for that event, how it differs from other distances. And so far I've done half marathon, 5K, 1 mile, and I just did the 800 meter this weekend. And it's just been super fun to just experiment and experience the differences in training for certain things. What are the benefits of it? What does training for the 800 meter look like while I'm also trying to maintain a certain level of cardiovascular fitness? Or it's how little actual running can I do and still not suck at a 5K for something like that. So anyway, whatever. This isn't a cardio podcast. Every time Bryan and I come on here, it's like fucking, we're just like hit this hybrid, talk about this shit. But so I just did the 800 meter this weekend. Super fun, a really cool distance. Just every distance has been its own form of hell, just like in its own really cool, fun way. And yeah, just a dichotomy between how I think about lifting and cardio, where without the goals of competing, even just against me, I do these races at a track nearby at fucking 7 a.m. There's no one there. But even just having that, I wouldn't do it otherwise. But lifting, I go into my garage, get a pump, enjoy myself, and I just don't necessarily need that goal. It's been great. We don't need to go through my whole training. 3 days a week, full body each day, cycling through 6 different leg movements across 2 weeks. Bryan and I talked about this on a couple weeks ago, being like, I'm only doing 1 leg day per workout. So that's only 3 leg movements, but I couldn't really just pick 3. I was like, yeah, no matter which 3 I pick, I feel like I'm missing something that I don't. Again, I'm not panicking, but I wouldn't want to miss it for a 12-week mesocycle or something. I wouldn't, if I'm like, oh, leg extension, ham curl, hack squat or something, I could pick the most biased or the least biased pressing form where I'm getting some glutes and some quads, but okay, I'm missing a hinge pattern, let's say. So I was like, all right, let me do leg extension, ham curl, hack squat, Bulgarian, hip extension, and glute med kickback. just for something frontal planey, right? And I just really like that. Across the 2 weeks, I'm like, cool, I'm checking at least like a movement pattern boxes. So far, so good. It's been enjoyable.
So you're training, you said you're doing like one leg workout 1 week and then you're doing the other the 1 week and then
So
flopping
it's
back and forth.
every day's full body, similar to Bryan. I'll do a leg day. I'll do a leg movement first, and then a bilateral press, bilateral pull, and then I'm only training delts as that fourth thing. I'm not doing any bicep and tricep work right now. And so day one will be like leg extension, pull up, press, lateral raise or something. And then the next day be ham curls, something. But I'll hit 3 leg movements across day 1, 2, 3. And then next week will be a different leg movement with the same upper body stuff from, let's say, the first Monday from last week, just to, over the course of 2 weeks, be like checking the movement pattern boxes I want to check.
So with the legs, what's the kind of rationale just for the legs? Is it like because you feel like you're hitting them enough, like with the amount of like cardio you're doing, or is that kind of where you have that more flexibility with your legs, or is it just not a priority as much
Doing
as you
that,
would say you're
doing that little amount of volume, or doing just maybe just like that many exercises, or which part?
just like how switch it up? Like it seems like you're like, obviously you're hitting legs, but you're staying consistent with the upper body movements, but then the legs, you're a little bit more flexible and like going every other kind of week with say leg extension. Well, that's what
It's
I'm
just less of a priority. And so just like totally fine with them being at maintenance, and running is a little bit more demanding from a lower body fatigue perspective. Honestly, I've been able to maintain on that low amount of volume, and aesthetically a little less tied to the hope for growth in my lower body. And if that leaves me maintaining muscle with a little bit more room to fatigue my legs running, I'll take that any day. At this point, extra fatigue on my legs for a little growth. I'd rather have that fatigue be put towards my ability to do better, more, whatever, more intelligent or more running. Yeah.
makes sense. That's what I figured that was the case. And I'm assuming same thing with you too, Bryan, right? Again, you guys have a lot of that, especially with cycling and stuff. That's a lot of lower body volume that you're doing there. That we'll talk about fatigue, but obviously that's going to add up to some fatigue there. Jordan, what about you, man? Is there any like movement pattern, like any movements you're digging, exercises or anything like that you're really liking right now or anything like that?
No, I don't like Bryan. I don't really think I have room for, again, of course you could for fun, but I'm picking really high stimulus exercise, high stability stuff. I know I can execute well. Doesn't take me forever to set up, can get really close to failure, good stimulus. I know I'm not doing much. So I'm looking at these movements and I'm like, yeah, there's no room for a movement that I either don't really like or don't feel I can work really hard at, or takes a long time to set up. And I'm almost like, cool, Jordan, if you're gonna go this low volume approach, you don't get to pick as much based on fun. You don't have room for fun. I need to get in, make it effective, not take too long, work close to failure. And frankly, I'm pretty agnostic with a lot of these movements. Like ironically, the things I just mentioned, good stimulus, not crazy to set up, high stability, all go in the same bucket of things I would like doing anyway. So it ends up being a lot of movements I really enjoy.
Yeah, makes sense. And then both of you guys really here, since you guys you're doing 3 days, Jordan, Bryan, you're I think even less frequency, and you guys are both doing a lower volume approach. Do you find that you don't really have to do the kind of typical, hey, work your way up in the mesocycle and then reset and like deload? Are you able to like push that further now? And maybe you don't have to think about that as much now because you guys are doing lower volumes?
Yeah, I actually think that's a really good point and very good, great point to bring up. So I find I take 1 week maybe where I do slightly lower efforts. And then from there, I basically go to failure the second set. So I do 2 sets per exercise. The first set is basically to failure or 0 to 1. Like maybe I could have gotten another rep. I don't often do partials to be sure. And then the second set, I take to failure. And if the movement is conducive to doing partials, I'll do partials. If it's not, I'll just hang out in the bottom and feel the stretch for a little bit. So yeah, I do that. And then pretty much I've been microloading. So this is what I did when I did abbreviated training back in the day when I first started. The whole thing was you just go to failure and then you add 1 pound or 2 pounds a week, whatever the movement is, you add 1% load to the movement. And you just do that every week. You just add 1% and you go until you can't make your 1% increase for 2 straight weeks. And then you take a deload and start over again. And that's the simplistic approach I'm taking right now, where it's just, I'm going to do a little bit more than last week over the course of 20 weeks that potentially could be 20 pounds, and we'll just see where it leads.
Yeah, similar. Everything's at 0, 1 RIR. And honestly, I'll mostly, if there's an exercise, super high stability, pushing further to / beyond failure doesn't really cost me a lot emotionally, I'll lean into that a ton. Almost forced progression on most things, even if it's a myo rep forced progression where like, I got 10 last week, I'm just going to get 11, even if that costs me a myo rep. And that kind of training can get really freaking hard. But what I've found is by the time it gets really hard, I don't know, 8, 10, 12 weeks, like I usually have a life thing that pops up where I'll hit the reset button and start back with maybe 0, 1 RIR, maybe 1 or 2 RIR, and then find myself myo / partial repping 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 weeks later, and then another life thing pops up. And so no current planned deloads at the moment, except if I'm doing one of these tests or one of these races, I'll usually, hey, I take 2 to 3 days, maybe a day or two off beforehand as part of a taper, maybe a day or two off on the back end. And I call that a deload.
Yeah, no, Bryan, I don't know if this is something that you have been doing. Maybe I'm just like, because it's just fresh and whatnot, but it does seem like in the training, we've gotten closer to like failure and like adding in like partials and stuff like that a lot sooner than in the past. Cause it will be like week 2 and it's already like 0 to 1 RAR. And then the next week it's already partials. I'm like, damn, I remember it was like week 4 or 5 that we'd start doing this stuff. So I don't know if that's like the case, like if that is something that I'm more biased because of recency bias, or if that's actually the case.
That was just the smoothest transition ever into the discussion around fatigue. Yeah, way to go. No, honestly, yeah, I think I'm just unscared of fatigue at this point more and more. And it's been a consistent kind of thought in my brain is that we're not fragile. And it takes a lot of volume to really elicit like an overtraining response. And so I'm not scared of taking a little bit of volume and working hard on it. I'd be more scared of taking a shit ton of volume than anything else. So that's, I think, what you're seeing in that.
Yeah. I definitely, again, as I've learned more too, I definitely feel, and as Cass mentions in this post, and this is the post I wanted to bring up and chat with you guys about, we'll just start here since we're here now at this point. But like he mentions, it's fatigue's going to be part of the process if you are trying to really progress and push things that make sense. And then, like you said, we're not as fragile. And also, I feel like too, the training is important, but also how you recover outside of the gym, I think is important too. And probably something that we need to focus on versus, oh, that's fatiguing from a training standpoint there. I know, Bryan, I saw you commented on it recently. So I don't know if you ended up reading this after I said I wanted to talk about this today, but yeah, Cass had that post. Was there too much fatigue mongering? And I do feel like this is something that people get super worried about. And so I just want to get your guys' thoughts on it. I don't know, either of you can start first. I guess, Jordan, if you want to start first on it, I don't know if you had any thoughts on it in terms of Cass's post and anything that you found interesting from what he had posted.
Yeah, totally. And this has been something that I think we have talked about in roundabout ways for a while. And so there's a lot of interest in what is more like everything. The minute Dr. Mike said stimulus fatigue ratio out of his mouth, like everything has been like a lot of things have been looked through that lens. Hey, what gets me more stimulus? What gets me less fatigue? How can I optimize those two things? But the essence, I think, of Kaz's post is twofold, and his position on this is twofold. The first is that we adapt to things, and what might be fatiguing for one person at one time, that SFR can change. And so if you don't train with high repetitions, and you start training with high repetitions, you might find the SFR is worse. You might get the same stimulus in a perfect world, but it's more fatiguing. Weeks of doing that, maybe you adapt and all of a sudden SFR is equally favorable, which I think makes a ton of sense. And I think anytime I've gotten stuck into something, I've found that it's less fatiguing over time. And the second thing is that stimulus fatigue ratio becomes more important the more you do, and really only matters for people that are pursuing very specifically up against the boundary of what they can recover from. And I'm not saying everybody who's listening to this has their recovery so in check that they just have so much battery life for recovery that they can just do whatever they want and doesn't matter. But a lot of people are like worrying about high repetition versus low repetition, training 3 or 4 days a week, or 2 RIR or 0 RIR, training 3 or 4 days a week. Like, it's unlikely that if you take a plan that's 3 or 4 days a week, everything programmed logically, and you turn up the RIR from 2 to 0, that it's going to go from I could recover to I can't recover. It's a lot of people are like, oh, this higher repetition, low repetition is more fatiguing. Yes, it's more fatiguing, but even when you do that, you have room left in your cup afterwards. What actually matters is, was this change so much extra fatiguing that now I can't recover and adapt? And even if that's true, is that true over time? In an acute, I've made this change to my training, it's more fatiguing, I now can't recover. That might be true, by the way. I would say that Kaz is saying, but I would also say that for a lot of people, it's not the case that this single SFR change that you've made is going to take you from not recovering to recovering, or from recovering to not recovering. And then even if you have begun to see that you are not recovering, fatigue is really building in a meaningful way, it's not true to assume that you won't adapt and all of a sudden be able to recover, and this is now whatever change you've made is a viable strategy. So the first part of adapting to it I see very often, but is less of a concern to me. I think a lot of people, unless you're really pushing the boundaries of what you can recover from, and I will say, Bryan and I, with the considering hybrid training, it matters. It matters in the context of looking at everything we're doing, not so much just the lifting. So I am very much concerned with SFR, but not because of just the lifting, because over the course of everything I'm doing, it's a consideration because I am doing quite a lot And to be honest, probably not actually. Like it's like even Bryan said, like a little bullish on we're less fragile and maybe we can handle more than we think. I'm probably not even close to what I can recover from. I've actually in 15 years of training never come up against being so fatigued that I've had multiple weeks regressing. And so maybe there's a little fear mongering about raise your hand if you've ever had back-to-back weeks of carrying so much fatigue that you notably regress on lifts across the board. Nobody has had that unless, okay, maybe a subset of people. So yeah, general fear mongering, I'm down with that. That's probably happening. It's unlikely that one little change in SFR, like doing more reps or a little bit closer to failure, is going to take you from recovering just fine to overreaching, overtraining after a couple weeks. And it's probably the case that you adapt to it and the SFR gets more favorable over time.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Jordan said. He probably said it better than I could have said it anyways. So I'll just note that even last year when I was in that crazy world of lifting 5 days a week and biking 6 days a week, and this year I was somehow able to exceed that performance from last year. That performance from last year was still a PR. Like that was still my best biking that I had done despite being in that under recovered state. And I think that when you take a step back and look at how that relates to hypertrophy, like there is fatigue present in hypertrophy. You're always training in a state of fatigue. You're never unfatigued. Being unfatigued is something that is done in a taper for a strength phase so that you can manifest maximal strength for one time at an event. In hypertrophy, you're always training under fatigue. And so I think as long as you're still making some progress, you're not too fatigued. And like Jordan said, when was the last time that you went 2 weeks and regressed and then realized you were in the shitter? That happens so rarely. And it is highly likely that people can handle a lot more than they think they can. The last point that I want to make on this is that I tend to look at psychological motivation as an extremely good proxy for doing too much. And I don't know if Cass touched on that in that post. I didn't see it. I didn't read through it like super thoroughly because, like you said, I just noted and commented on it this morning. But I did look at all the different the slides and read through all the comments, and I didn't see anything about psychological and motivation to train. And I know for me and the clients that I've worked with in the past, that lack of desire to train or less of a desire, if you're motivated to do something, you can push through some of those initial feelings of not wanting to go, but eventually it would catch up with you. That feeling usually preempts physical overtraining. Like you will psychologically not want to go to the gym anymore before you actually physically cannot go to the gym. And so I tend to look at that as a really good factor for myself and clients, especially to know when potentially we're doing too much.
Could I just do devil's advocate both of what we're saying? I also wouldn't say that we're invincible and that there's never an appeal to dropping fatigue and optimizing stimulus to fatigue. You have a client who's in a deficit, also going through a breakup, also, and it's okay. Can we make some of these subtle changes to just ease some of the fatigue off while keeping stimulus high? Totally. Can we train a smidge further from failure, or just do a smidge less volume, or pick better SFR exercises, or train with lower rep range? So, yeah, and I'm all about turning those knobs if I have a client in that scenario, for sure. Totally. I think it's also fair to say that even a regular person, let's say air quote, only training 3 or 4 days a week, which I think is very adequate for 99% of people, but I'll use the word only here because bodybuilders might listen who are training more than that. Sure. I think that there's a scenario where I'm still like, cool, like it's good for me to know that maybe now's not the time for us to up our rep ranges a bunch. And maybe now's not the time for extra volume. And it's still important to know, and there might be circumstances where it's applicable.
It's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Like you said, just if you have stuff come up, for example, I had a client that she's from Tampa, and obviously you guys know the hurricane there. It's okay. That's probably a time when you have a ton of stress outside of the gym that it's like, hey, we probably need to back off for this week. But yeah, I think the psychological side of things is key too. But do you think that's always the case where it's like doing too much, or do you think it's again just like you said, maybe stuff outside of the gym that that could potentially be the big cause there, not necessarily like how much training you're doing? Or I mean, what do you think, Bryan? Do you think that's a case, or it just depends on the person?
I mean, for sure, like you can always enhance what you're doing outside the gym in some way. Any of us that have kids and work jobs and have parents that are getting old, and I mean, there's 1,000 things that are going to occur that we experience in our 30s, 40s, and beyond. It is impossible to think of a life that is absent of those stresses. And yes, it can be improved. I feel like for most people, they find a homeostasis where it works for them. Like they're sleeping between 6 and 8 hours a night. They're dealing with some work stress here and there, but they have some practices to calm down and find their center throughout the day, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't often see drastic swings in the outside the gym things, aside from whether you're eating in a caloric surplus or eating a caloric deficit. But like the other things are just there. They're just operating in the background all the time. And it's tough to be like, dude, just reduce your stress and you can totally handle more volume. Okay. Sure, tell my kid to stop waking up at 2 a.m. or whatever.
Yep. Yeah, some of the things are just out of our control, right? You can't do anything about that. Cool. I guess the big thing that he was just trying to say is fatigue going to be a cost, and maybe people have been overly concerned about fatigue, and maybe again, it's something that's just the cost of doing business and the cost of making progress. And again, it's probably not worth it to like overly focus on, like, just don't avoid things that are just because they are fatiguing you. That doesn't mean you should necessarily avoid those things, because again, that's going to be what drives your training forward and drives muscle growth. That's what I got of it. Did you guys say that's pretty much what he had said there, or
Yeah, I think a lot of this, and with the lengthened partial stuff, what we're going to see is that a lot of this, in my opinion, is like a response to the other side of the internet. Call it like the Paul Carters and the Chris Beardsleys. And that is something that I see. This fatigue post is a response to that. And I think the lengthened partial study was Milo and Pax's kind of attempt at responding to that as well. And it may or may not have actually worked the way they intended it to.
Jordan, anything else you want to add on the fatigue topic before we dive into the length and partials?
No, I feel good about it. I feel good.
Cool.
We covered it well.
Yeah, like I said, though, I definitely think fatigue was something that, and again, maybe it was more the RPE kind of background. I don't know what it is, but definitely something that was like, oh, you definitely want to avoid it. It all, at least that's how I felt. And that's something that I've changed my mind on recently there. So cool. There was a preprint. It's actually next to, or both preprints. Length and partial repetitions elicit similar muscular adaptations as a full range of motion during resistance training in trained individuals. That's not a great title for social media, but again, more length and partial stuff here, is this has kind of been the hot topic for the last couple of years now at this point. So just curious, does anybody want to hit on maybe what the findings were and then what you guys took from it? And then we'll go from there.
Bryan, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. So the study was comparing lengthened partials on a few different arm movements to full range of motion. And they included videos, which was super cool, so you could see, but it also drew some attention to some of the flaws, I think, in some of the exercise technique, or some aspects that might make you realize why the results turned out the way that they turned out. So like doing what were the curls? It was like a standing dumbbell curl and a Bayesian curl behind the body. So there was like various ways in which the Bayesian curl was executed, where some people were doing it more lengthened than other people, even when it was supposed to be a lengthened partial. And then the single arm bicep curl has the problem that a lateral raise has, which is there actually isn't any tension at the bottom of the movement. So I think that was an odd movement to pick, even though it's a common movement. So they went super hard on ecological validity with the study, in that they wanted it to resemble the way that people actually train, but maybe compromised on some other aspects as a result of that. And then they had 2 tricep movements as well. Was it an overhead extension?
Yeah, it was an extension and a hammer strength press.
That's right. So yeah, the press was a weird one, because the tricep is actually the most active at the top of the rep as the arm locks out, and the chest is most active at the bottom. So the people doing the partials were actually at a disadvantage if you're looking at tricep hypertrophy.
The biggest fundamental thing for me is the pursuit of external validity in lieu of sufficient internal validity. That sounds like fancy. What it means is, what they tried to do was what they wanted to see was, let's get trained individuals doing a real program that real people do. Because the critique of the 52-week study and all this crap is that nobody's doing that. Nobody's doing 5x10 to failure, and no one's doing 5x10 back squats to failure with a minute rest and all this crap. So they said, we are Milo, Pack, and Jeff Nippard, and we are going to build a program that people really do. So that is external validity. This replicates or represents what happens in the real world. But that program is not good at answering the question of length and partials versus full range of motion. So that in the pursuit of external validity, they made themselves they made the study less good at answering the question. The question that you can answer is limited to exactly what they did. It's very hard to extrapolate anything from this paper other than, hey, if you do a program like this, you could do length and partials. Cass made this point of, we're not at a place yet for external validity. We don't have good enough internal validity where it's leg extension versus leg extension, partial versus full ROM. We haven't yet confirmed internally on a very simple, microscopic, acute, zoomed in mechanism of this to then extrapolate it to like full on programs. And then Bryan made some good points of like, the Bayesian curl was executed in a lot of different ways. And by the way, Bayesian curl, like what I'm guessing is these guys are like, cool, let's use an exercise that's like hip and lengthened overloaded and all. But like a Bayesian curl is tough to execute. So they went with external validity. Here's a move that a lot of people are doing instead of what exercise would help us best answer the question and what's going to help us standardize and isolate a single variable, control for as many variables as we can. I sent you guys a screenshot just now while we were talking of Jeff. By the way, I love Jeff. I think Milo and Pack are awesome. They're doing good work. I don't get into the drama. I want them to keep I want everyone to keep doing this stuff because I don't give a shit about the drama. I'm just here to learn, so it doesn't matter to me. But Jeff, I think Jeff posted a reels about the study. And in the reels for the study, there's a video of a guy doing partial ROM and full ROM single arm dumbbell row. And the full ROM has his elbow like just behind the torso, and the lengthened partial is his arm like 1 inch lower. And it's so kudos to Kaz, who also went through a lot of the bicep curls and was looking at the difference in the range of motion. And if you have a full range of motion, right? So if you straighten out your arm and let's call that 0 degrees, and then your arm's at 90 degrees, and then the other full range of motion is all the way till the forearm touches the bicep, you should have a difference in range of motion of maybe not 90 degrees, right? Because you can't get your forearm to go over the top of your bicep. At least, I don't know, a difference of quite a few degrees. They had, I don't want to try and regurgitate the exact numbers, but the difference in range of motion was not great enough, mostly because the movements weren't standardized. The people doing bicep curls, some of them were standing in free space. Some of them had their elbow against the wall. And when they had their elbow against the wall, some of them were doing it differently. If you have your elbow against the wall, imagine you're holding a dumbbell. If you keep your elbow against the wall, you actually can't get your arm to be 0 degrees because the dumbbell will hit the wall. People were doing that. So in the pursuit of external validity, they were unable to actually appropriately answer the question. Then you brought up the hammer strength. And I know I'm going off here because I'm not going to do this on my podcast, so I appreciate we get to do it here. The hammer strength press, all presses don't really use triceps at the bottom. So while the tricep might be lengthened at the bottom, it's not doing anything at the bottom. So it's a dumbbell press or a hammer strength press is not like a bottom half hammer strength press is not a lengthened partial for the triceps because it's not doing anything. And so that group who was just doing bottom half partials saw worse tricep growth than the group doing full range of motion all the way to the top of the press locking out. Not only does the tricep not do anything at the bottom, but and I don't want to say not do anything at all, but let's say it does very little at the bottom. It does a lot more at the top. And not only does it do a lot more, it does a lot more on every press, but it does a lot more on fixed implement pressing, Smith machine pressing. What bothers me is and Cass used the word hubris of going for external validity and then shitting the bed with actually helping us answer the question about the partials. I don't know about you guys. What I've learned is, if you're doing a program, you could throw in some length partials and it might not matter. I'm not sure what else I know now.
My big take from it really is just that both things work, and that if you do lengthen partials, it's likely you're not going to get worse hypertrophy unless you're totally messing it up and doing a lengthened partial on a hammer strength press for your triceps. But like most people would do, they would do a hammer strength bottom partial for their chest, right, which likely is a totally fine decision to make. Yeah. So like I was saying earlier, I think this is like they built this study almost as a response to Paul and Chris, because Chris and Paul are on this stand right now that
they both blocked me. I gotta know.
It's been the same for a year. Like, I'm not telling you anything new. Granted, they're now on the 3 times a week full body thing, but from a bro split like 2 years ago. But they're on this thing that all these muscles don't benefit from lengthened, and that there's really no point ever doing that because the fatigue is so high that there's no benefit in doing it. So it wraps back to the cast thing of like fear mongering fatigue. Like, if you do lengthen partials, if you go past failure and do partials in the lengthened position, you're likely going to be causing too much fatigue. And so they were trying to argue that full range of motion is better, right? So then Pack and Milo have this study. It feels to me like it's, check this out, lengthened partials do work in advanced trainees. Oh, that was the other thing. They say that they didn't work in advanced trainees, only in beginners. So they're like, boom, look, check this out. We win. Lengthened partials work in advanced trainees because look, they got the same results. And then Paul and Chris look at the exact same study and they're like, no, full range of motion outperformed lengthened partials. Look, 6.6% to 5.9%. And it's insignificant, so it doesn't matter. And they're like, leans that way. And by the way, we've always been saying, just stick with full range of motion and you're better off. And they're like, no, but look, lengthened partials, they totally work too. And it just feels like this somewhat childish argument back and forth. And one group's trying to use science by conducting studies to prove their point, and the other one is just breaking down the studies that they conduct to prove their point. And I don't know, it's just wild out there in the internet these days.
If it's funny, I don't want to put Cass on a pedestal, but he's someone who I admire, and I admire his brain, and I just appreciate what Cass does after he thinks about something for a few days and what he has to say. But I think a lot of people need to go to hypertrophy camp, because I was listening to some discourse in the caption between Jeff and Cass. And Cass was basically, I'm sure this is an idea he's had for a long time, because Bryan and I went to hypertrophy camp. We ran all these tests with the partials. Cass's point remains, hey, if doing lengthened partials lets you use more load or get more volume load or more reps with the same load, and we can talk about what sort of characteristics of an exercise might let you do that. But
short overload movements,
short overload movements, or movements with a break, like a movement where there's a rest in the rep, like at the top of a dumbbell press or whatever. Then that seems like more practical. And I love Jeff. Jeff's holy shit, who are we talking down to Jeff? Jeff's the man. He's a genius, super smart, amazing YouTuber, whatever. But he was like, actually, I think it'd be the opposite. And I was like, Jeff was making a whole point about how actually he thinks doing bottom half RDLs is where the lengthened partial would really shine.
No way.
And I was like, guys, go do the experiment. That's why I really appreciate what we did at hypertrophy camp, because I think it sounded really cool conceptually, but doing it and being like, oh, it plays out again for most people in the group with a very similar pattern was really helpful for me to conceptualize when and how lengthened partials might make sense.
Yeah, I pretty much primarily use them on short overload movements at this point. I don't use them at all in like hack squats, RDLs, anything like that. If you want to prioritize the lengthened position, the 1 1/4s or 1.5 reps are great for those compound lengthened overload movements. But where they shine for sure is definitely going to be on the short overload, where you can use more weight, like Cass was saying.
What about like chest type movements? Is that something that you like?
So we did a test at hypertrophy camp where we had to do 3 different types of dumbbell presses with the same weight. So it was either like a full rep with the little short rest at the top and then back down, like how most people perform full range of motion. It was a bottom partial only, or it was a 1.5 rep where you're counting the number of lengthened exposures that you get. And the bottom partials only was the worst performance of all of them. And because there's no break, you're just constantly under tension the entire time. So you got the fewest reps. The full range of motion set, you got the most like full reps, but the 1.5 reps allowed you to get the most lengthened exposures. And we pretty much saw that across the board, or at least percent of people got those results. So I think that's how since that moment literally have been since how I've been using it for more lengthened overloaded movements.
So again, my takeaway was like, again, this study, obviously you guys talked about it, didn't really prove what they wanted it to essentially, but would you guys still say for you, where do you stand at the moment? Is it like, hey, this is something that you've been mentioning that you would incorporate it with short and overload movement. So I'm assuming that's probably where you're at, but it's just, again, right now, if you can do some lengthened work, but also understand that you can do full range of motion, but also the exercise you do is important as well too. Is that kind of where you guys stand at this moment on it as a whole?
I'll go on record to say that how bullish do I want to be on a record here? I put myself in a record here. I wouldn't do, and there's a lot of reasons why for me, I wouldn't do any only lengthened partials on anything. Now that's because maybe I'm slightly less in the pursuit of the most optimal results ever. Maybe that's just like a philosophy that makes me miss out on whatever maybe potential gains there. But I see the partial reps more as a set extension in conjunction with a lot of full range of motion work. Then I can't think of an exercise where I'm like, I'm only doing bottom half partials. And the reason I feel that way, and if you look at this, is let's say they're the same. Let's say lengthened partial and the full range motion is the same. I don't know that lengthened partials feel less fatiguing. So if it's for the same benefit, I'd have to be like, wow, just doing the bottom half of that curl, it's a failure. Really, I can read a book while I'm doing that. It feels very similar to me. So I'm going to have a non-scientific view here and just say, I'm banking there's something about the short position that matters at all, which is my tiebreaker. Because if we're saying they're the same for growth, I'm banking that there's a regional hypertrophy benefit, or maybe there's a functional health, tendon health benefit, some sort of orthopedic benefit, like something that matters. Because if we're saying it's the same, then I'm either going to go with the one that has some other benefit, and I'm banking there's something out there, or the other one would have to be a lot less fatiguing. so that my training feels easier or that I can do more. And I'm just not sure. I look at taking a bottom half leg extension to failure and I'm like, wow, that's, by the way, you'd be using more load. And I'm like, wow, that's way better. Is it? Is that way less fatiguing? Do I emotionally feel like that's less fatiguing? I don't. It sounds more fatiguing to me, to be honest. I personally I have not ever programmed only lengthened partial, except for fun and variation, by the way, under the veil of cool, let's try something new. Let's change it up, get out of your head of how you do things and let's do something different. I'm on board with that. But I'm banking on there being maybe very little difference in gains, but maybe something, maybe regional hypertrophy, maybe tendon health, maybe something else orthopedically. And I'd rather bank on a mysterious potential benefit that hasn't been fleshed out in the research yet over this idea that somehow lengthened partials are going to be less fatiguing. So I'll do a forced progression on a lat pull down. So in week 1 of a cycle, every single rep, the bar has to touch my chest. And then every week after that, I put 5 pounds on the bar and I do that many reps, no matter what happens to the range of motion. And I do that as a fun and variation for sure, but also as a way of, okay, I'm over time going to move the average range of motion towards more lengthened. And maybe in the final few weeks, every rep is like to the nose, in between my nose and forehead. Those sets are not less fatiguing. I'm sorry, they're not less fatiguing. So if they're the same benefit that I got in week 1 going to full ROM failure, let's say, then to me it's more fatiguing, but let's say it's the same. I'll go with the one that has maybe some benefit that we just don't know about. That's my current stance.
Can I just one bit of clarification on that statement? A row where your elbows either wrap behind your back or stop at your midline, would that be considered a completely different movement, or is it merely a lengthened partial when your elbows only go to your midline?
I think it changes something about the movement. If you're doing the exact same execution, I'd lean more towards it's a lengthened partial than it's something else. But it is also something else where arms pass behind the body. There's a tension pass off from lats to other musculature for sure. But I'd call it a lengthened partial in lieu of that nuance.
What about like a lateral raise? Like you will always take your lateral raise up until the cable runs along the arm versus stopping at like arm height or parallel or whatever.
The way I'd phrase it is I don't see one of them as more or less fatiguing. I don't see stopping. If we are taking it to the same point of, if I take a set till I can no longer touch the cable to my arm at the top, or I take it to the point where I can no longer go 90 degrees where there's still a gap between the cable and my arm, I think they're both equally fatiguing to me. And you could say, well, you got more lengthened exposures with the stopping here, and then there's potential benefit there. And that's a fair point. But I might counter and say what I might do is just take it to full range of motion failure and then hit a couple almost all the way up. And maybe I get the best of both worlds. But you make a good point I've programmed in my group bottom half partial dumbbell lateral raise, but I've usually done that for people who don't have any other way of getting a lengthened bias. So that's a fair counter. I think I might be even more inclined to program reverse drop set or set extension. Reverse drop set is essentially a set extension where you are extending the set by doing the reverse drop set. But okay, maybe there's some context for people who might not otherwise have an opportunity to challenge that muscle meaningfully in a lengthened position, but I still might opt for, maybe I wouldn't opt. Maybe there are some circumstances. Fair.
That's how I pretty much use it with my group too. So like we're doing a lying leg curl with bottom 60% ROM now because most people don't have a seated leg curl. So that's like their option to hit the lengthened part of the hamstring and in lieu of the seated leg curl. So we do program it. But when I look at our list of how many bottom 60% range of motion movements I have in there, it's 12 maybe. And they're all short overloaded type movements. And so, anyways, I thought that was an interesting conversation, interesting tangent.
Yeah. So again, maybe my takeaway is, again, it's Jordan, you're like, hey, I'm not going to ever just do lengthen partials like for the entire.
I have to take that back now. Brian made some good points. But okay.
Sorry. Okay.
No.
But my takeaway was, hey, at the end of the day, training hard, like doing enough volume, like those are going to be your big rocks with this, right? Like we're talking just some extra a little bit here. But again, doing like things like extensions on the set from a partial standpoint is how you would do it. And then my other takeaway too is just we still probably want to train, like you want to train with the full range of motion, but you probably don't want to skip out on that lengthened portion, right? And it's probably good to include some short as well too, but you can also use this as a way to maybe hit certain muscles in ways that you can't hit with certain exercises, and just a way to extend the set and add in some, what's the word I'm looking for? Not variety, novel stimulus as well too, and just psychological as well too from that standpoint. Would you guys agree with that? Anything else you would add to that, or anything like that from the lengthened partial?
Yeah, just watch out for all that extra fatigue in that lengthened position.
I would amend my stance after that of I wouldn't me personally, by the way, I wouldn't now go to prioritizing that lengthened partial, but I would absolutely use it in circumstances where it complements the rest of the program for the right person appropriately. I will probably on average program more full range of motion lying ham curls than I will lengthen partial lying ham curl, but I will absolutely program lengthen lying ham curl occasionally for sure. And in conjunction with set extension into partials with reverse drop sets as well with 1.5 reps. I think that's fair. Yeah.
Yep. Co-sign that.
Cool. Unfortunately, this is a good top conversation, but I do have to run here. But I think this was a ton of great information for people. I guess before I let you guys go, is there anything you want to end the podcast with? And then where do you want to lead the audience to? Bryan, you can go first, and then Jordan, you can go next.
Yeah, no, thanks for having us. Great conversation. Always good to connect with you fellas. And the normal stuff. This is like my 12th time on here, so people should know me by now.
Join my group, not Bryan's. That's what I'll say. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Always fun to chat, guys. Appreciate your time. Thanks, man.
Yep, absolutely, guys. We'll do this again. I'm sure there will be more length and partial talk and other fun hypertrophy stuff that we can chat about next time. And it's always great chatting with you boys. Talk to you soon.
Yep. Peace.